Welcome to This Week in the Triangle. My name is Stephen Horn. I'm an independent journalist here with the Triangle Trumpet. Let's talk about some local stories over the past week. And our first story up here is from a follow-up story from last year, September 2024. A man named Zachary Paul Olson, 24 years old, showed up at NC State campus near the Greek Village with a handgun, a Ruger Max 9 pistol. He told some bystanders at a nearby Chipotle that he wanted to know which fraternity was, quote, the rapiest, so that he could, quote, teach them a lesson. So the police were called. They find him nearby. They arrest him. He tells them that he's interested. He wanted some vigilante justice. Apparently, his ex-girlfriend, had been the victim of sexual abuse of some sort. Not at NC State, nothing to do with NC State particularly, but he wanted to target a fraternity to, do some vigilante justice. Apparently, he thinks all fraternities are, guilty of sexual assault or something of that nature. So the police catch him with this handgun, but he is not charged anything in relation to the threats, anything in relation to, apparently being willing to shoot people. He was only charged with carrying a concealed handgun and carrying a gun on educational property. And last week, he got a pretty lenient plea deal, a pretty favorable plea deal, where he would plead guilty to the crime, but it was part of a conditional discharge agreement. And under North Carolina law, what that means is that if he completes his probation, he completes his community service. That's 2 years of probation, 225 days of community service. If he completes that, this will be wiped off his record. Those charges will be discharged. So, you can find plenty of examples where people have been people have gone to prison for months or even years for not actually even showing up with a weapon, but just making threats. But looking that up, those usually appear to be federal charges. So if you are charged federally with making threats, it seems like you are a lot more likely to end up in prison. Whereas apparently, if you're only charged in North Carolina courts, you might not even be charged with making threats, even if you show up with a handgun. Now, this might have turned out a little differently if he had been threatening perhaps some other group that law enforcement or authorities were more interested in protecting than fraternities at NC State. Maybe if he had showed up with maybe an abortion clinic with a gun saying that he wanted to do some vigilante justice on abortionists, who knows? Maybe he would have been charged with more serious crimes. Maybe he would not have gotten, such a favorable plea deal where this won't even be on his record if he completes his probation. And one thing of note is that Olson was a third-year law student at Campbell University at the time, and he was also an intern at the Wake County District Attorney's Office, a part-time intern. He was obviously fired from that when he was charged, but maybe he just knew where to look for a lawyer, what sort of good deal could be worked out for him. And our next story was one I did some deep investigating on, because this was a bit of a scoop, a story that has not been reported in any other media in depth as far as I'm aware. This was an immigrant who was arrested in Raleigh after years on the run from statutory rape charges in Washington. So Christian Jonathan Buezo Bayeres is accused of engaging in sexual relations with two girls 5 to 7 years his junior, beginning when they were 13 and 14 years old, the former of whom he is alleged to have eventually impregnated and abandoned. So Buezo Bares is also the subject of a detainer by Immigration and Customs Enforcement because he is not a U.S. citizen. So these charges were filed in 2023, but the investigation began in 2022, and that is when police say he disappeared. They say he, quote, unexpectedly stopped going to work, changed his phone number, and has not been seen by various family and friends, leading law enforcement to include that he was, quote, actively trying to evade involvement with law enforcement. And that was until over 3 years later when he was arrested by the Raleigh police in North Raleigh off of Capitol Boulevard. Apparently, it's not clear how long he's been in North Carolina for, but his residence is listed at an apartment complex nearby in North Raleigh. He is currently being held in the Wake County Detention Center. Now, I went and read the court documents. I won't go through all of the gruesome details of the allegations here on this stream tonight. But I did put an article together, going into detail, having all of the sources for anyone who is really interested in learning more about some of the people who are roaming at large in our community, or were until just recently. That is at triangletrumpet.news, triangletrumpet.news. You can find articles like this, as well as the weekly roundup, these stories that I'm going over, sent out in a newsletter form each week. And our next story, some of y'all may remember, in 2023, there is a shooting at the UNC campus. Initially, this was feared to be some sort of active shooter situation. The whole campus was put on lockdown, but it ended up being a UNC professor who was murdered by a graduate student. And so the news last week is that the state of North Carolina and the UNC Board of Governors have agreed to a $750,000 settlement with the family of that murdered professor. They had brought a wrongful death lawsuit, and so this is the settlement. So the name of this professor is ZJ Yan. I'm sure I'm butchering that, but so Yan was a professor at the Department of Applied Physical Sciences at UNC, and so 34-year-old graduate student Talia Key, he showed up to campus with a gun, apparently got into some sort of argument with Yan, and then shot him. And so Key was charged with first-degree murder, but he has been found unfit for trial due to what is apparently untreated schizophrenia, hallucinating, hearing voices, whatnot. And so he is indefinitely committed to the Central Regional Hospital. That is the hospital in North Carolina where they keep mental patients like that who have been accused of some serious crime, but the court, if they hear from experts who say, okay, this person is not mentally fit to stay in trial, then they will be committed against their will. And the way the law reads is that if the medical professional is ever determined that he does have the mental capacity to face those charges, he will have to come back to court. It's not a get out of jail free card. So basically, either he'll be in a mental hospital for the rest of life, or if he ever gets out of the mental hospital, he will go back on trial for that charge of murder. And one of the interesting things about this case is the persistent, I even hate to say conspiracy theories because I think that's overused, but a lot of people have looked at the facts of this case and assumed some sort of possible nefarious motive for the murder besides interpersonal conflict. And I haven't seen any evidence of that, but a lot of people, or quite a few people, have suggested to me that there is some involvement with maybe the Chinese Communist Party, because both the professor was killed and the graduate student who killed him were born in China, were immigrants to the United States, or that maybe it even has something to do with the origins of COVID-19 and their possible involvement to UNC, that this was some sort of murder as part of a cover-up. Honestly, that theory is out there a lot. I really don't see any evidence that would sort of meet the barrier of Occam's razor to suggest that is there's any likelihood at all, compared to this just being, a graduate student who had mental problems, who had interpersonal workplace conflict, and who came and killed Yan. So they were on a research team together at the Department of Applied Physical Sciences, not anything to do with the coronavirus. They were heard arguing before the murder, and Yan had also he had made posts on social media complaining about workplace conditions. So it seems to me, you put these facts together, I don't really see any. No one has presented any evidence to me that this is some sort of communist plot. Even though I understand why people might be a little skeptical. And our next story here actually also involves UNC. This is the election lawsuit over UNC's digital ID being used for voter ID. So the State Board of Elections, now that it is controlled by the Republicans, has agreed to settle a lawsuit brought by the state and national GOP last year over the approval of UNC's digital ID. I believe it's called the UNC One card, that was approved to be used for voter ID in North Carolina. And, Republicans took issue with that. Lots of people concerned with election integrity took issue with that because it was basically saying, hey, you show the election official your phone screen, and that will work as your voter ID to be able to vote, just the phone screen. And so when they approved this was the subject of a lawsuit because that is obviously very easy manipulatable. There was one of the affidavits filed with the lawsuit even showed, by someone who is apparently a student or who had his digital ID, how he was able to clone it, manipulate it using easily available tools without any specialized knowledge. Because if you're on the UNC campus, if you're using the wireless verification, you're swiping it, you're tapping it. That is using electronic verification. There's protocols, cryptography, whatever. But when it was approved to be used as a voter ID, the election officials were not provided with any of that technology, any of that training. So it's literally just looking at a phone screen and saying, does this look like a legitimate ID? How are they supposed to know? How are they supposed to know whether it's a legitimate ID or a screenshot or some sort of cloning that you have modified? So the North Carolina State Board of Elections has agreed that the sort of electronic or digital ID does not satisfy North Carolina's requirements for voter ID because it specifically says a photo identification, and it says a card, not just identification, not just photo, but a card. And it seems pretty clear from the black letter language of the law that the card refers to something physical, not something digital, because it's not just identification, it is a card. And so the State Board of Elections to settle this lawsuit has agreed, yes, we won't do any electronic voter ID in the future. And our last story here from Durham is Protest Watch. I like to keep track of the protests, the demonstrations that go along in the area. And in this case, this is sort of an emergency response to ICE activity at the courthouse. And one of the things that is interesting about the story is the involvement of local elected Democrat politicians. So Durham County Commissioner Nita Allen, let's see. Hang on, I'm still figuring out this technology. So Nita Allen, puts out some tweets on Twitter or X saying 4 ICE agents at the courthouse this morning in plain clothes and a white van with government plates circling around. And she even uploaded some images with the people who she said were undercover ICE agents. And so the activist groups got involved, and there ended up being a protest. I believe around 70 to 90 protesters showed up sort of as an emergency response to law enforcement officers being at the courthouse to do some sort of immigration enforcement. And so what was reported by the Durham sheriff via ABC 11 is that only one immigration enforcement agent was at the courthouse. They were in uniform and they were, quote, looking for a convicted felon. So, they're they're not just picking random people off the street, even though they also do that, but they're at the courthouse for someone who is convicted. That is, that's what the information is being put out by law enforcement. And what the activists say is that the person they were looking for didn't show up for their court date, which, if I were them, maybe I wouldn't be bragging about that a convicted felon isn't showing up for their court dates. But apparently they want to keep this criminal who is an illegal alien. They want to keep him in Durham because apparently, criminals are a vital part of the Durham identity and the Durham community. And so these activists, including Allen, the county commissioner, the Durham Workers Assembly, various groups, various leftist groups, all, are able to get this protest to get people to show out. And they actually even returned to the courthouse the next morning. They're worried that, ICE would show up again. Let's see the images we have here. Yeah, so they say 150 people showed up the next day. Not nearly that many people in the picture, but you can still see it's a group of people who showed up at the courthouse. this is even the next day. So the second protest over just the ICE agents coming to, probably pick up or do something with a convicted felon. And so the mayor of Durham responded as well. This was actually in response to a post I made about this, reporting on the situation. Maybe if ICE agents were not illegally kidnapping residents who have not committed crimes, tearing apart families, and placing them in conditions worse. Oh, that's a typo. Worse that animals live in the wild and deporting people to countries they have no association with, Nita Allam wouldn't have to stand on the forefront with my other colleagues to protect our community. What happened under my watch is my community stood up for one another. You know what else is happening under my watch? You ignoring the very fact that the practices of ICE not identifying themselves when they detain someone. If my officers at Durham Police have to identify themselves, so should Trump's. And so that is a whole lot of, these are basically open borders talking points, because if immigration enforcement cannot remove anyone who is here illegally, then that is open borders, de facto, even if it's not de jure. So this idea that is illegally kidnapping residents for ICE to come pick up illegal aliens, obviously that is absurd unless you're operating from the basis that all immigration laws are inherently, invalid. So therefore, enforcing those immigration laws is kidnapping. What we're actually seeing is people who are illegal aliens, they have violated the law and they're being removed in accordance with the law. That is not illegally kidnapping. And if we're talking about tearing apart families, any criminal who is charged with a crime, they're going to be removed from their family. They're going to be taken to jail. Now, maybe they're allowed out on bond. Maybe they're allowed out on whatever conditions. But every enforcement of law is separating families, because we don't send the whole family to jail, and we don't let people who are being charged with crimes just do whatever they want. So in that sense, enforcing immigration laws is not tearing apart families any more than enforcing any other law, except your family can go join you in your country of origin. You can arrange through the CBP One app, to let them know that you're deporting yourself. They'll pay for your travel. They'll give you $1,000, and then you can take your family with you and go home. So these are just some. Just a few of the reactions. And at this rally, we also had Durham School Board member Natalie Bayer and Durham City Council member Javiera Caballero. So Caballero and Allam are both immigrants. Caballero is a Chilean immigrant. Allam she was born in Canada, but obviously her parents immigrated to Canada from somewhere else, probably the Middle East. She is a Muslim, wears a hijab, whatnot. And so I think what is really interesting here is a couple points. It's not just that these are Democrat politicians who are supporting these protests, supporting this pretty activist response to ICE. It is also this sort of emergency response where people are showing up. They hear about this, they show up pretty quickly the same day. And I think there really is a potential that this could escalate in some very bad ways. Now, one thing is, what I observe from looking at like the pictures of this protest is that these attendees do appear to be whiter than the overall demographics of Durham. So maybe a little less potential for violence than what Durham is known for, which is crime and murder and whatnot. But yeah, I think there is potential here that this could go south very quickly, because what we've seen in LA, I believe the riots there, some of them were sort of kicked off by the sort of direct emergency response where ICE is performing some sort of immigration enforcement, and then people start showing up to counter it, to get in the way, and then it just escalates, snowballs from there. And the other side of sort of escalation that we've seen is people laying in ambush, Antifa going to lure ICE agents out and attack them. There is Antifa active in Durham, and they have been holding some direct actions, in opposition to immigration enforcement. Now, generally, the Antifa and the more mainstream or elected Democrat officials, generally they stay more separate. But if there is more combination of this, at least one of these flyers was shared by Triangle Radical Events, which has also been involved with organizing some of the Antifa style stuff, or at least sharing information about that. If there is that convergence of the most radical of the activists and the politicians, I think this could really go south pretty quickly. There are laws in North Carolina requiring that the sheriff cooperates. As far as the sheriff says, they are cooperating with these laws where they have to respect ICE detainers, and provide some. There's different laws regarding notification and whatnot, but when we see these elected Democrats who are so vehemently opposed and willing to put themselves out there to say, yes, don't enforce the law, yes, take activist actions against it, well, who knows what will happen. And so I guess I would not be 100% shocked if this does escalate further. I will definitely be on the lookout for that and potentially covering it in person if it goes that direction. This has been This Week in the Triangle. I'm Stephen Horn. If you've been listening, thanks for tuning in.